That somber evening in the Alpha's lodge was thick with the scent of pine smoke and simmering aggression. Torches flickered on the rough-hewn stone walls, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to echo the restless tension in the room. At the head of a massive oak table sat Alpha Mordred, a mountain of a man whose silver-streaked beard and piercing amber eyes commanded absolute silence. To his right sat his son and heir Dan, who possessed his father's broad shoulders and intense gaze, but where Mordred's was hardened by decades of rule, Dan's held a simmering, restless fire. Flanking them were the pack elders, their faces a roadmap of old scars and older grievances. "The western border was breached again last night," growled Elder Kale, his knuckles white as he gripped the table. "Another calf taken, not by fang or claw but by corruption. The earth itself was sour with their magic." A low rumble of agreement moved through the elders. "The witches grow bold, Mordred," said Elara, the only female elder, her voice like grinding stones. "Their hex wards creep closer to our territory. Their potions poison the streams our pups drink from. This is no longer mere coexistence. This is a silent war." Dan listened, his jaw tight. He'd seen the blighted patch of land, smelled the cloying, unnatural stench of the magic. But his mind, treacherously, conjured a different scent. Wildflowers and ozone, the scent that clung to Fiona's hair when he'd secretly met her by the moonlit gorge 2 nights prior. Her laugh, a sound that felt like a secret rebellion in his soul, echoed faintly against the elder's grim words. "We cannot charge in with tooth and fury," Mordred's voice boomed, silencing the murmurs. "An open war with the Coven would decimate both our people. We need intelligence. We need to know their weaknesses, their plans." Elder Kale leaned forward, his eyes glinting. "Then we send a spy. Someone to infiltrate their ranks, to live among them and report back. A wolf in witch's clothing." The proposal hung in the air, dangerous and audacious. "I will go." The words left Dan's mouth before he could second-guess them. Every head turned to him. The silence that followed was heavier than any growl. Alpha Mordred's eyes narrowed, the paternal concern in them warring with the Alpha's authority. "No," he said, the single word final as a slamming door. "Out of the question. The risk is too great. To send my heir, the future of this pack, into the viper's nest. I will not take that chance." But Dan stood, his chair scraping against the stone floor. The fire in his eyes was no longer simmering. It was ablaze. "That is precisely why I must be the one to go, Father. How can I lead this pack one day if I am forever shielded from its greatest threats? How can the wolves respect an alpha who has never faced true danger, who hides behind his father's cloak?" His gaze swept across the elders, appealing to their sense of strength and tradition. "I am the best choice. I am strong, I am fast, and I understand the stakes better than anyone. If I am not worthy of this task, then I am not worthy to be your heir." The elders looked at each other, and Dan saw the reluctant approval in their eyes. They valued courage above all else. Mordred saw it too. His son had backed him into a corner, using the pack's own values as a lever. The Alpha's shoulders, usually squared with unshakable confidence, slumped almost imperceptibly. "The boy speaks truth, Mordred," Elder Kale said, his voice grudgingly respectful. "His courage does him credit." Mordred held his son's gaze for a long, tense moment. He saw not a reckless boy, but a determined man, and in that, he could not publicly deny him without undermining him forever. Reluctance was a bitter taste on his tongue, but he gave a sharp, single nod. "Very well," Mordred conceded, the words seeming to cost him. "But you will not go as a wolf. You will go shrouded." He turned to Elara. "The ghost petal." Elara nodded and left the room, returning moments later with a small drawstring pouch made of supple deer hide. She handed it to Mordred, who held it up. "The scent of this flower is anathema to our kind," he explained to Dan, his voice low and grave. "It masks our natural odor, making us undetectable to those who hunt by smell. The witches will sense only a human. But you must never open the pouch, Dan. The pollen is potent. A single pinch in your palm, rubbed over your skin each dawn, will be enough. But inhale it directly, and it will weaken you, dull your senses and your strength for a day. He stood and walked around the table to Dan. In front of the entire council, he did something he had not done since Dan was a small child. He placed his hands on his son's shoulders. The alpha's mask fell away, leaving only a father's fear. You are the future of this pack, my son. Do not take foolish risks. Gather your information and return to us. Your mission is to observe, not to engage. His voice dropped to a whisper meant only for Dan's ears. Come back to me. Then, in a gesture that stunned the room into silence, Alpha Mordred leaned forward and pressed a firm, lingering kiss to his son's forehead. It was an ancient blessing, a transfer of strength and protection. Dan felt the weight of the moment settle on him. He took the deerskin pouch, the dried petals within rustling softly. It felt like holding a secret and a betrayal all at once. He was going to infiltrate the witches, to spy on the very community where Fiona lived and laughed. The conflict was a sharp pain in his chest. But as his fingers closed around the pouch that would hide his wolfish nature, a dangerous, hopeful thought bloomed in his heart. This was not just a mission for his pack. It was a chance to see her, not in stolen moments under the moon, but in her own world. He was walking into the viper's nest, but his only thought was of the beautiful, forbidden flower waiting within. At the witch's coven, the woods, which was supposed to be a place of power, was a chamber of frustrations for Fiona. Sunlight dappled through the canopy of ancient oaks, illuminating the motes of dust and magic that hung in the air. Fiona stood in the center, her brow furrowed in concentration, a worn spellbook open at her feet. Incendia, she whispered, her fingers tracing the intricate sigil in the air. A few pathetic sparks, like angry fireflies, sputtered from her fingertips and died before they hit the leaf litter. Incendia, she commanded, her voice sharper this time. A single weak tongue of flame, no larger than that of a candle, flickered and vanished. Useless, she muttered to herself, kicking at a root. The book, Embers of the Primordial Flame, seemed to mock her with its grandiose title. Her mother, Juliana, had mastered this spell before she'd even bled for the first time. For Fiona, 17 and the heir to the Coven Head, it was just another reminder of her inadequacy. With a sigh of defeat, she snapped the book shut, the sound echoing sharply in the quiet glade. She gathered her things, the weight of the spellbook feeling heavier than stone, and trudged back towards the Coven's enclave. The witches' houses were nestled in a protective circle, woven into the very landscape with cunning magic. Their gardens were lush, bordering on wild, filled with herbs that shimmered with latent power and flowers that bloomed in impossible colors. Fiona's home was the largest, a cottage that seemed to have grown from the earth itself, its roof thick with living sod and its walls intertwined with flowering vines. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of drying lavender, sage, and something darker, like ozone after a storm. Juliana was at the hearth, stirring a small, bubbling cauldron. She was a formidable woman, her beauty sharp and severe. Her hair a cascade of night black streaked with a single dramatic silver bolt. She didn't look up as Fiona entered. The primordial flame, Juliana stated, her voice cool. It wasn't a question. Fiona dropped her book onto a wooden bench with a thud. No, just sparks. It's no use, mother. The fire. It doesn't answer me. Juliana stopped stirring. The silence that fell was heavier than any reprimand. She turned, her eyes the color of frozen violets, sweeping over her daughter with a disappointment so profound it was like a physical chill. Sparks, she repeated, the word dripping with disdain. The daughter of Juliana, descendant of Hecate, mistress of the Vale. And she can barely light a kindling. Do you understand, Fiona, that power is not a suggestion. It is a requirement. The wolves grow bolder by the day. They smell weakness like blood on the wind. How can you lead this coven? How can you protect our sisters, if you are unable to summon a simple flame? Each word was a carefully aimed dart, finding the most tender parts of Fiona's insecurities. I'm trying, Fiona said, her voice small, hating how childish it sounded. Trying is what humans do, Juliana snapped, turning back to her potion. Witches do. You are useless in this state. Completely unfit to succeed me. Perhaps Ilara's daughter. She was cut off by a timid knock at the door. A young witch, barely older than Fiona, peeked in, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. Coven Head Juliana. Forgive the interruption. The new gardener is here. You asked to see him before he begins. Juliana's expression shifted from maternal disappointment to regal authority. Send him in. Fiona moved to the window, wanting to be anywhere but under her mother's scrutinizing gaze. She looked out at the sprawling magical garden, a place she usually loved but which now felt like just another extension of her mother's perfect, powerful world. The door opened, and the young witch ushered in a young man. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in simple, rough-spun trousers and a tunic. He held a worn cap in his hands, his head bowed slightly in a show of deference. His hair was a tousled, sun-streaked brown. "This is Dan, ma'am," the young witch said. "He's from the village. He's taken old man Harris's landscaping business." "Look at me," Juliana commanded. Dan lifted his head. Fiona, watching from the window, felt her breath catch. His eyes were a startling warm hazel, and they held a quiet strength that seemed at odds with his humble posture. There was something about him. Something solid and calm. He was handsome, in a rugged, unpolished way that was entirely different from the cunning, sharp-featured young men of the coven. Juliana circled him slowly, a predator assessing new prey. Fiona knew her mother was using her senses, probing for any hint of deception, any taint of the wolves they so despised. She saw her mother's nostrils flare slightly, then relax. She sensed nothing. The ghost petal pouch, hidden in Dan's tunic, was doing its job. "Harris spoke highly of your work," Juliana said, her tone neutral. "The moon blossoms are delicate. The venom rose requires a silver touch. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am." Dan's voice was deeper than Fiona expected, a low rumble that was strangely soothing. "I'll treat your garden with the utmost care. See that you do. You may begin with the overgrowth at the western edge. Report to me at the end of each day." Juliana dismissed him with a wave of her hand. Dan bowed his head again, his eyes flickering for the briefest moment towards the window, towards Fiona. Their gazes met. It was only a second, but in that heartbeat, Fiona felt a jolt, a spark of something that had nothing to do with failed spells. Then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Juliana turned back to her cauldron, the brief interlude over. "Useless in magic and now gaping at the hired help," she said, not even looking at Fiona. "A truly inspiring performance, daughter." But Fiona barely heard the insult. She was still staring at the door. The image of the gardener's steady hazel eyes burned into her mind. For the first time all day, the frustrating inability to conjure a flame wasn't the only thing occupying her thoughts. The following weeks at Juliana's estate were a lesson in cognitive dissonance for Dan. The viper's nest he had been sent to infiltrate was, in fact, a place of quiet industry and gentle harmony. He tended the moon blossoms, their petals shimmering with a soft internal light, and carefully pruned the venom rose with silver shears, all under the watchful, but not unkind, eyes of the witches. He heard no boasts of captured werewolves, no whispers of sinister plots. Instead, he overheard conversations about healing salves, lunar cycles for planting, and protecting the forest they all called home. The greatest threat he'd witnessed was a heated debate over the proper pronunciation of an ancient healing chant. The mission was becoming a farce. He had nothing to report to his father but the peaceful routines of a reclusive people. Desperation clawed at him. He needed a source, an insider. And his thoughts, inevitably, turned to Fiona. He saw her rarely, a flash of her dress disappearing around a corner, the sound of her frustrated sigh from an upstairs window. She was like a ghost in her own home, always retreating from her mother's imposing presence. Dan found himself watching for her, the memory of their brief, charged glance at their first meeting lingering. One afternoon, driven by a need for answers that was now tangled with a growing personal curiosity, he followed the sound of murmured spells into the woods. He found her in the same sun-dappled clearing, but today she wasn't trying to summon fire. She was dancing with water. Her hands moved with a gentle, flowing grace, coaxing a ribbon of water from a small stream to weave through the air like a liquid serpent. It spiraled around her outstretched arms, catching the sunlight and scattering it into 1,000 tiny rainbows. A small, genuine smile played on her lips, a sight so different from the frown of frustration he usually saw. In this element she wasn't useless, she was an artist. Dan watched, mesmerized, his mission forgotten. This was not the destructive power his pack feared. This was beauty. This was peace. And in that moment, watching her quiet concentration and the effortless joy she found in her magic, he felt the first, undeniable pull of something deeper than curiosity. He fell in love. His shift in stance was clumsy, a wolf trying to be still in a world of delicate sounds. The snap of the twig under his boot was like a thunderclap in the quiet glade. Fiona gasped. The watery ribbon splashed back into the stream. Instinct, born of a lifetime of warnings about wolves and intruders, took over. She spun around, her hand flying out, a word of pure defensive power tearing from her lips, a power she didn't know she possessed. A wave of biting cold shot up Dan's legs, locking them in place. He looked down, stunned. A sheath of glittering, magical ice encased his legs from the knees down, fusing him to the forest floor. For a moment, there was only shocked silence. Fiona stared at her own hands, then at him, her eyes wide with horror. "Oh, goddess! I didn't mean to. Never. I can't even make fire." She rushed towards him, her earlier serenity replaced by panic. "I'm so sorry. Are you hurt?" The cold was intense, a numbness that was starting to bite deep. But Dan saw the sheer terror on her face, not at him but at her own unexpected power. The lie came easily, softened by a concern he hadn't expected to feel for a witch. "I'm fine," he said, his voice surprisingly calm. "Just chilly. Can you release it?" "That's the problem," she wailed, wringing her hands. "I don't know how I did it. I'm not a strong witch, I can't just undo it." Her distress was genuine, and it sparked a protective instinct in him. "Hey," he said softly, catching her gaze. "Breathe. Just like you did with the water. Calm and focused. I believe you can do it." His quiet confidence seemed to steady her. Fiona took a deep, shuddering breath, her eyes locked on his. She whispered words too low for him to hear, her fingers tracing a reverse sigil in the air. The ice shimmered, cracked, and then dissolved into a cool mist that vanished on the breeze. The sudden release, combined with the profound numbness in his legs, destroyed his balance. His knees buckled and he pitched forward. Fiona lunged, trying to catch him, but he was far too heavy. Instead of breaking his fall, she tumbled down with him. They landed in a heap on the soft moss, Fiona on top of him, her hands braced against his chest. Time stopped. Her face was inches from his. He could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes, feel the quick, panicked beat of her heart through her thin dress. The scent of wildflowers and ozone, the scent he secretly craved, enveloped him completely. Her lips were slightly parted in surprise. For a heart-stopping second, every rule, every warning, every ounce of his duty vanished. There was only her. He saw the same shocking realization dawn in her eyes, not of fear, but of a dizzying, undeniable connection. A blush spread across her cheeks, but she didn't move away. The moment stretched, fragile and perfect. But then the reality of who he was, a spy, a werewolf, a betrayer, crashed down on him like a physical blow. This was forbidden. This was a death sentence for them both. Gently, his own heart hammering against his ribs, he shifted, helping her to her feet. His legs were still prickling with returning sensation. I should be the one apologizing, he stammered, unable to meet her eyes now. I didn't mean to sneak up on you. I was just walking. He took a step back, then another, the distance feeling like a chasm. I have to get back to the garden. Without another word, he turned and walked away, forcing himself not to run. But with every step that carried him farther from the clearing, the frantic racing of his heart followed him, a wild, traitorous drumbeat that echoed for miles. He wasn't just walking away from a witch. He was walking away from the first true thing he had ever found, and the ache of it was already more painful than any magical ice. That night, the moon was a cold, sharp sliver in the sky, but it wasn't its light that kept Fiona awake. It was the memory of a warmth, the solid feel of Dan's chest under her hands, the startling gentleness in his hazel eyes. She tossed and turned, her mind a whirlwind of confusion. He was just the gardener, human. Yet, the way her magic had responded to his presence, the way her heart had hammered against her ribs when they fell, it felt like a spell far more potent than any in her mother's books. When sleep finally claimed her, it offered no respite. It gave her a vision so vivid it felt more real than the waking world. She saw a cottage, not her mother's imposing house, but a smaller, sun-drenched home surrounded by wildflowers. Dan was there, his smile easy and full of love, his arms around her. Between them, 2 children with her fiery red hair and his warm hazel eyes laughed, chasing butterflies. The feeling was one of such profound, peaceful belonging that it ached. Fiona jerked awake, a gasp tearing from her throat. The dream clung to her, the ghost of that happiness, a cruel contrast to the emptiness of her dark room. What did it mean? Fear, cold and sharp, slithered down her spine. This was forbidden. This was madness. She fled to the woods before dawn, seeking solace in the one thing that usually grounded her: magic. But even the water felt different now, its flow reminding her of the easy grace with which Dan had moved. Across the estate, Dan was just as restless, pacing the small, sparse quarters he'd been given. He replayed the fall in the clearing 100 times. Each time, the feeling of Fiona on top of him, the connection that had flashed between them, grew more intense. He was falling for the enemy. The mission, his duty to his pack, his very identity. It was all crumbling because of a witch with sad eyes and a surprising talent for water magic. He couldn't let this happen. Love for the enemy was a betrayal of the highest order. It would jeopardize everything. Gritting his teeth, he pushed the thoughts away, locking them in a dark corner of his mind. Duty. He had to remember his duty. Under the cover of the pre-dawn gloom, he slipped outside and gave a low, specific whistle. A moment later, a homing pigeon, a sleek gray shadow, fluttered down to his outstretched arm. His heart felt like a stone in his chest as he pulled a tiny rolled parchment from his pocket. With a charcoal stick, he scrawled a brief, damning message. Coven is peaceful. No evidence of aggression. Perimeter vulnerable at dusk, when they gather for the evening chant. It was the truth, but it was also an invitation for an attack. He tied the note to the bird's leg, his hands trembling slightly. "Fly true," he whispered, and launched the bird into the sky. It was done. He had chosen his pack. The snap of a twig behind him made his blood run cold. He spun around, every muscle tense, expecting to see Juliana's furious face, the glint of a witch's blade. It was Fiona. She stood there, holding a small plate with a slice of honey cake, her expression a mixture of hope and nervousness. I saw you were awake. I thought you might be hungry," she said, her voice soft. Relief warred with a fresh wave of guilt. His cover wasn't blown, but her presence was a different kind of threat. "I'm not hungry," he said curtly, turning to walk away. He had to put distance between them now. "Dan, wait," she called out, her voice breaking. "Why are you avoiding me? Please." He kept walking, his back to her, each step an agony. "Last night, I had a dream," she continued, her words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "It was about us. Life together. Felt so real. Dan, I think I love you. The words hit him like a physical blow. They were everything he wanted to hear and everything he couldn't bear. He stopped, his shoulders rigid. He remembered the elders' grim faces, his father's warnings about their cruelty. To protect her, to protect his pack, he had to be cruel himself. He turned around, his face a cold mask. "Love me," he scoffed, his voice dripping with a disdain he didn't feel. "You're being a pain in the ass, Fiona. Distraction. I'm here to work, not to play games with a lovesick witch. Leave me alone." The light in her eyes extinguished instantly. Her face crumpled, and she took a stumbling step back as if he'd struck her. Without another word, he turned and walked away, forcing himself not to look back, each step feeling like he was walking on shards of his own heart. The moment he was out of sight, the dam broke. Fiona dropped the plate, the honey cake shattering on the forest floor, and sank to her knees, sobs racking her body. The pain was unbearable. He had looked at her with such contempt. But just as her tears fell, a sound cut through the morning air. It was a long, deep, and unmistakable howl from the direction Dan had gone. It wasn't a howl of anger or warning. It was a sound of pure, unbridled joy, a triumphant, soul-deep song. Fiona froze, her tears stopping as suddenly as they had started. She looked up, bewildered. It was a wolf, a werewolf, so close to their borders. Fear gripped her. But then a strange, inexplicable feeling washed over her. The howl didn't feel like a threat. It resonated deep within her, answering a call she didn't even know she had made. The joy in it echoed the joy from her dream. In that moment, an impossible, terrifying understanding began to dawn. The howl wasn't just a sound. It was an answer. It was his answer. Dan was the wolf. And that howl, it was for her. The following day, Dan knew he had to send a message. The days after sending the pigeon were a special kind of torture for Dan. The mate bond, now fully awakened by his wolf's triumphant howl, was a physical ache in his chest, a constant, pulling thread leading directly to Fiona. He fought it with every ounce of his will, throwing himself into his work until his muscles screamed, but it was useless. His wolf was relentless, a presence in his mind that was no longer a separate entity but the core of his being, and it wanted its mate. The conflict was tearing him apart. The mission felt like a lie. The memory of Fiona's heartbroken sobs haunted him. He had to see her. He had to try, in some way, to explain. When he saw Juliana leave the estate on Coven business, a dangerous resolve solidified in him. He searched the house, his senses heightened, but found it empty. The pull led him back to the woods, to their clearing. He found her there, but the graceful water weaver was gone. Instead, Fiona stood with her back to him, hurling jagged shards of ice at a large oak tree. Each one struck with a violent thwack, splintering the bark. Her magic was raw, unfocused, a mirror of the turmoil he felt inside. "Fiona," he said, his voice rough with emotion. She froze but didn't turn around. The air grew cold. "We need to talk," he continued, stepping closer, his boots crunching on the frost-kissed leaves. Sorry for what I said. 'Twas a lie. All of it." Still she was silent, her shoulders tense. "The truth is, I'm just an ordinary man. And you're a witch. Your mother would never approve of someone like me. I was trying to protect you. And myself." It was a flimsy, human excuse, the only one he could grasp for. Fiona slowly lowered her hands. The spell she'd been trying to cast fizzled out. Her concentration was shattered. She turned to face him. Her eyes weren't filled with tears, but with a fire he'd never seen before, a blazing green fury. Before he could say another word, her hand flew through the air. The slap connected with his cheek, a sharp, stinging crack that echoed in the quiet glade. Dan didn't flinch. He met her gaze steadily. "I deserve that." Her eyes narrowed. She slapped him again, harder this time. This blow wasn't just about anger. He could feel the searing pain of his rejection, the humiliation, the confusion, all channeled into the strike. She drew her hand back a third time, her entire body trembling with pent-up emotion. But this time Dan moved faster. He caught her wrist gently, his large hand enveloping hers. "I am so sorry, Fiona," he whispered, his voice thick with regret. The fight seemed to drain out of her. Instead of pulling away, she surged forward. She grabbed the front of his tunic, pulled him down, and crushed her lips against his. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was desperate, fierce, and full of all the words they couldn't say. It was an answer to his howl, an acceptance of his apology, and a claim all its own. When they finally broke apart, breathless, Fiona's eyes were blazing with a new kind of intensity. "I don't care what my mother thinks," she panted. "I don't care about any of it. We can leave tonight. We can elope. Just you and me. Forever." The words were everything his wolf longed to hear. But the man, the Alpha's heir, knew the devastating reality. "Fiona, no. We can't," he said, his voice breaking as he pulled away from her embrace, creating a painful distance between them. "Why?" she cried, her voice raw with hurt. "Give me one real reason." There was no other way. The lie had to end. He let the control he'd held so tightly finally slip. His eyes, usually warm hazel, bled into the glowing, fiery red of his wolf. His fingers elongated into sharp, black claws. He stood before her, not as a gardener, but as a werewolf. He expected terror. He expected her to scream, to run, to summon her magic against him. Instead, Fiona went very still. She didn't look afraid. She looked understanding. A slow, sad smile touched her lips. She took a slow, deliberate step forward, then another. She reached up, and with a tenderness that stole the breath from his lungs, she cupped his fearsome, transformed face in her hands. "Oh, Dan," she whispered, her thumb stroking the coarse hair on his cheek. "Is that all?" She stood on her toes and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to his cheek, right beside his snarling muzzle. "I don't care," she said, her voice steady and sure, her green eyes holding his red ones without a trace of fear. "I don't care if you have claws. I don't care if your eyes glow. You knew. I think I've always known. It doesn't change anything." In that moment, with her touch silencing the growl in his throat and her love disarming the beast within, Dan knew the mission was over. The war was over. The only thing that mattered was her. The truth, once spoken, hung in the air between them like a shattering crystal. Dan had expected the kiss, the acceptance of his beast, to be the final hurdle. But the deeper betrayal, the reason for his presence, now had to be confessed. He jerked back from her touch as if burned, her kindness feeling like a brand of his own deceit. "Fiona, no. You don't understand. We can't be together." The pain returned to her eyes, but now it was mixed with confusion. "Why?" "Because you're a werewolf. I told you it doesn't matter." "It's not that," he interrupted, his voice ragged with guilt. "It's why I'm here. My people. Your people. They've terrorized us for years. Cattle mutated, land poisoned, our kin disappearing without a trace." He forced himself to hold her gaze, to see the hurt he was causing. "I'm not a gardener, Miss Spy. I was sent to find your weaknesses. And I've already sent a message. My father's warriors will be at the edge of your coven by dusk to free our people and wipe out this village." Fiona stared at him, her face pale. But the emotion that dawned in her eyes wasn't guilt or anger. It was stunned, horrified realization. "Kidnappings. Poisoned land," she whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. "Dan, no. Tisn't us. We would never. We're a peaceful coven. We tend to the land, we heal it." "Lies," Dan snarled, his wolf rising to the surface, defensive and cornered. "The scent of your magic is all over the attack sites." "That's because we go there to cleanse it," she cried, stepping forward and grabbing his arms, her grip surprisingly strong. "Listen to me. It's the vampires. Lord Valerius, from the obsidian spires to the east. He's the one capturing werewolves and witches alike. He's experimenting on them, twisting them with dark magic. The mutations, the poison. It's a byproduct of his foul work. My own aunt is missing. My mother has been trying to find a way to stop him for years. The world tilted on its axis for Dan. The peaceful gardens, the gentle routines, Fiona's own struggles with aggressive magic. It all clicked into a terrifying new picture. The enemy wasn't the woman standing before him, her eyes pleading for him to believe her. The enemy was a shadow they had both been fighting in the dark. The vampires, he breathed, the fight draining out of him. The conviction in her voice was undeniable. He saw the same fear, the same loss he felt in his own pack, reflected in her face. It wasn't a war between wolf and witch. It was a hunt, and they were both the prey. By the moon, he gasped, horror dawning as he thought of the homing pigeon, the message now winging its way to his father. I've led my pack into a trap. If they attack your coven, they'll be weakened, exposed. The vampires will pick them off easily. Have to go back. I have to warn them. I'm coming with you, Fiona said immediately, her voice firm. No, Dan said, instinct taking over. It's too dangerous. My father. He'll see a witch and he won't listen. He'll what? Attack. Fiona finished, her chin lifting in defiance. And how will you convince him? With a story from his spy son who fell in love with the enemy. He'll need proof. He'll need to hear it from me. I am the Coven Head's daughter. My word carries weight. I'm coming. Dan saw the stubborn fire in her eyes. The same fire that had allowed her to accept a werewolf. Arguing was futile. And a treacherous part of him, the part bound to her by the mate bond, didn't want to be separated from her again. The thought of leaving her behind was its own unique agony. All right, he relented, the word tasting of both fear and a strange newfound hope. But we have to go now. And you have to do exactly as I say. Fiona simply nodded, her expression grimly determined. There was no time for farewells or preparations. The peace of the clearing was gone, replaced by the urgency of a race against time. Together, the werewolf, heir and the witch, their ancient enmity forgotten in the face of a common foe, turned and ran. They ran not away from their destinies, but directly into them, their fates now inextricably intertwined against the true darkness that threatened to consume them all. At the pack, the great hall of the Alpha's lodge, once a place of proud tradition, was now a cauldron of roaring tension. Alpha Mordred's face was a thundercloud, his fury so potent it seemed to suck the air from the room. Have you lost your mind, boy? He bellowed, his voice shaking the very timbers of the hall. He jabbed a thick finger towards Fiona, who stood resolutely at Dan's side. You bring the enemy into our very den, into our sacred council. The elders, who had once praised Dan's courage, now looked upon him with a mixture of pity and disgust. Elder Kale's lip curled. The witch has clouded his judgment, Mordred. I warned you this mission was a mistake. Father, please listen. Dan pleaded, stepping in front of Fiona. We've been wrong. The witches aren't our enemy. They're victims just like us. It's the vampires, Lord Valerius. He's the one behind the kidnappings, the mutations. He's been playing us against each other. Lies. Mordred roared, refusing to even look at Fiona. She has bewitched you. She's twisted your mind with her spells. He turned to the two guards at the door. Seize the witch. Throw her in the dungeons. As the guards moved forward, Dan let out a low, guttural growl that was purely instinctual. He shoved Fiona behind him, his body vibrating with protective rage. You will not touch her, he snarled, his voice dropping an octave. Then to the stunned council he declared, She is my mate. A collective gasp rippled through the room. The mate bond was sacred, undeniable. But Alpha Mordred's eyes only hardened further. Then you will reject the bond, he commanded, his voice cold and final. I will not have my bloodline tainted by witches' filth. Before Dan could respond, the heavy doors of the lodge burst open with a blast of green energy. Juliana stood framed in the doorway, her expression one of icy, murderous rage. Behind her, a dozen witches stood ready, their hands crackling with power. And I will not have my daughter bonded to a thieving, lying wolf. Juliana's voice cut through the air like a shard of ice. Fiona stared in shock. Mother, how did you? Did you think me a fool? Juliana spat, her gaze fixed hatefully on Alpha Mordred. I knew your gardener was a spy from the moment he set foot in my garden. I allowed his charade to continue to see how deep the deception went. I followed you here to finally settle the score and free my people you've taken. Mordred took a threatening step forward. We have taken none of your people, witch. It is you who have terrorized our lands. Liar! Juliana shrieked. A generation ago, one of your kind stole our most sacred scroll, the Tome of Umbral Weaving, and delivered it into the hands of that vampire monstrosity. It contained spells of transformation, of dark binding. It is why Valerius has the power to create his hybrids. Your people gave him the key. The accusation hung in the air. A historical wound ripped open. The werewolves looked at each other in confusion, while the witches' faces hardened with ancient grief. In the center of the storm, Dan and Fiona's eyes met. And in that shared look, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Not as a wolf and a witch, but as two people who had been fed a narrative of hate, all while the true predator watched from the shadows. Stop! Dan's voice, strong and clear, cut through the swelling argument. Fiona stepped forward with him, standing together in the space between the two bristling factions. Can't you see? Fiona cried, her voice trembling with emotion. This is what he wants. The vampire lord. He stole your scroll, Mother, and he used it to frame the wolves. He's been making us fight each other so he can pick us off while we're weak. She's right, Dan said, his gaze sweeping over his father and the elders. While we're in here arguing about the past, the real enemy is out there, getting stronger on the power he stole from both of us. For a single, fragile second, it seemed like reason might prevail. The anger in the room wavered, replaced by a dawning, horrific understanding. But that second was shattered by a deafening explosion that rocked the very foundations of the lodge. The far wall of the great hall burst inward in a shower of splintered wood and stone. Through the dust and debris, figures emerged, pale, elegant, and deadly. And at their head, standing with an air of bored amusement, was a tall, gaunt figure clad in black silk, Lord Valerius. Behind him slithered monstrous hybrids, twisted fusions of wolf, witch, and something unspeakable, their eyes glowing with vacant malice. The vampire lord smiled, revealing elongated fangs. What a touching scene, he purred, his voice like velvet wrapped around a blade. The perfect gathering. It saves me the trouble of hunting you down separately. The dust from the explosion settled to reveal a nightmare-made flesh. Standing amidst the ruins of the lodge wall were not just vampires, but their captives, the missing. Juliana's hand flew to her mouth, a strangled gasp escaping her. Ilara, she whispered, her voice cracking. Among the hollow-eyed witches forced to march with the vampires was her own sister, the Aunt Fiona had never known, her face a pale mask of subjugation. A parallel wave of horror washed over the werewolves. Alpha Mordred, who had been a mountain of fury moments before, seemed to shrink. His amber eyes, fixed on a slender female hybrid with matted gray fur and familiar, sorrowful eyes, lost all their fire. Liana, he breathed, the name a prayer and a curse. Dan stared, his own heart freezing in his chest. The stories, the faded portrait in his father's chamber. The hybrid was his mother. Mother! Dan roared, lunging forward without thought. But Alpha Mordred's arm, still thick with muscle and trembling with grief, shot out and held him back with impossible strength. No, son. Mordred's voice was a ragged whisper, thick with agony. That is not her. Not anymore. She is his creature now. Dan struggled against his father's grip, seething with a rage so pure it burned. He turned his blazing eyes to Lord Valerius. "Why?" he bellowed, the word tearing from his throat. "Why are you doing this?" Valerius gave a languid smile, savoring the pain in the room as if it were a fine wine. "Why? For order. For unity," he purred, gesturing to the fractured groups before him. "Look at you. Wolves and witches, squabbling like children over scraps while a kingdom waits to be ruled. I am merely expediting the process. I will unify the supernatural world, and I will rule as its supreme leader. Your kind, properly motivated, will make excellent foot soldiers." That was the final blasphemy. With a roar that was more pain than fury, Alpha Mordred began to change. His body contorted, muscles rippling and expanding, fur erupting from his skin. In seconds, a massive silver-backed wolf stood where the Alpha had been, fangs bared at the vampire lord. It was the signal. The fragile truce born of shock snapped into a desperate alliance of survival. Witches hurled bolts of searing light as werewolves, in a wave of fang and claw, launched themselves at the vampire lines. The battle was a chaotic, bloody melee. The hybrids and the even more horrifying tribrids, creatures of wolf, witch and vampire, were relentless, their movements unerringly coordinated. The air filled with the snarls of wolves, the shouts of spells, and the cold laughter of vampires. The combined forces of the pack and the coven were being pushed back, suffering terrible losses. In the chaos, Dan saw his mother, the hybrid that had been Liana, lunge for him. He hesitated, his heart screaming in protest. It was the opening a vampire needed. As a set of cold, sharp fingers reached for his throat, a massive silver wolf, his father, slammed into the hybrid, knocking her away. Dan saw the agony in his father's wolfen eyes as his jaws closed, not to kill, but to subdue. But in that moment of merciful hesitation, a tribrid's poisoned talon slashed across the silver wolf's flank. Mordred howled in pain, and the Liana hybrid scrambled away, lost in the fray. Dan lost sight of her, a fresh wound opening in his soul. He fought his way toward Fiona, who was surrounded by 3 vampires, her water magic forming a defensive shield that was rapidly cracking under their assault. "Fiona!" he yelled. But as he reached her, something shifted. Seeing Dan in danger, a new power awoke in Fiona. The frustration, the fear, the love, it all coalesced into a torrent of raw energy. She threw her head back, her eyes glowing with an incandescent white light. "Incendia Maxima!" she screamed, not at the vampires but at the sky. A pillar of pure, primordial fire erupted from the heavens, slamming into the ground around her. The 3 vampires were instantly incinerated into ash. The blast wave knocked even Dan off his feet. The battle around them faltered for a moment, all eyes turning to the witch who had just called down the sun. Juliana stared, her face a mask of utter shock. "The solar rite," she whispered. "She's the key." And from his vantage point, Lord Valerius began to laugh, a sound of genuine, delighted triumph. He looked not at the destruction, but directly at Fiona, his red eyes gleaming with avarice. "The prime ignition," he exulted, ignoring the battle around him. "After centuries of searching. And she was just a little witch all along. Don't harm her," he commanded his forces. "The girl is the final component. She is mine." The war had just become a hunt, and Fiona was the prize. The battlefield became a vortex of focused chaos. At its center stood Fiona, a beacon of terrifying power, but also its most vulnerable target. "The girl. Bring me the girl." Lord Valerius's command sliced through the din, and a fresh wave of hybrids and vampires surged toward her. Dan became a whirlwind of fang and fury, a living shield. He moved with a precision born of desperation, tearing through any creature that dared get within 10 feet of Fiona. "Stay behind me," he roared, his voice a guttural promise of protection. But Fiona's initial burst of power had taken its toll. Her hands trembled, and the fiery aura around her flickered. Each subsequent blast of magic was weaker, leaving her panting and pale. She was a nova burning too fast, too soon. Juliana, fighting back-to-back with a grizzled werewolf elder, saw the danger. "We can't keep this up. They're endless. We must break his control," she shouted to Alpha Mordred, who, back in his human form, was bleeding from a deep gash on his arm. Mordred's eyes, filled with a lifetime of grief and a new, grim resolve, met Juliana's. He saw his son fighting a hopeless battle to protect the witch who held his heart. He saw the ghost of his wife in the enslaved hybrids. The Alpha's duty was clear. "He's too powerful head-on," Mordred growled. "But he's arrogant. He'll come for the kill himself if the prize is worthy enough." Without another word, Mordred let out a challenging roar that echoed across the battlefield. "Valerius, you want to rule? Then face an alpha. Or are you only brave when hiding behind your puppets?" He shifted again, the massive silver wolf charging not at the minions, but straight for the vampire lord, a deliberate suicidal attack. Valerius's lips curled in a sneer. A gnat's last buzz. He met the charge, moving with unnatural speed, his claws raking across the wolf's side. But Mordred wasn't trying to win. He was a distraction. He wrapped his powerful jaws around Valerius's arm, holding him fast, anchoring him in place. "Now, Dan!" Juliana screamed. Dan didn't hesitate. As Valerius was momentarily pinned by his father's sacrifice, Dan broke from Fiona's side. He transformed in mid-leap, a younger, faster wolf propelled by rage and grief. He slammed into the vampire lord, his claws finding their mark. Not the neck, not the head, but the chest. With a final, sickening crunch of bone and a surge of all his strength, Dan ripped Valerius's heart from his body. It was not a beating organ, but a desiccated, blackened thing that crumbled to dust in his grasp. With a final, sickening crunch of bone and a surge of all his strength, Dan ripped Valerius's heart from his body. It was not a beating organ, but a desiccated, blackened thing that crumbled to dust in his grasp. A silent shockwave erupted from the vampire lord. The hybrids and tribrids froze mid-action, their eyes clearing of the vacant red glow. The vampires shrieked as their connection to their master severed, their coordinated assault dissolving into panicked disarray. The spell was broken. The Liana hybrid collapsed, her form shifting back to that of a weary, confused woman. Juliana rushed forward, catching her long-lost sister, Ilara, in a tearful embrace. But Dan saw none of it. He stood over the dissolving body of Valerius, his gaze fixed on the silver wolf lying still on the ground. The great Alpha Mordred had given his life to create the opening his son needed. Dan fell to his knees, a howl of pure, desolate loss tearing from his throat. The cost of victory was etched into his soul. Fiona was there in an instant, her own exhaustion forgotten. She knelt beside him, not with words, but by simply placing a hand on his heaving shoulder. Her presence a quiet anchor in his storm of grief. A moment later, Juliana approached, her face softened with a respect that had never been there before. "He died a hero," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "He saved us all. My people owe him a debt that can never be repaid." The funeral pyre for Alpha Mordred and the other fallen was a somber, united affair. Wolves and witches stood side by side, honoring the sacrifice that had bought their freedom. In the months that followed, the healing began. The freed captives were reunited with their families. The scroll of umbral weaving was recovered from Valerius's spire and destroyed. And from the ashes of war, a new alliance was forged. It was sealed with a union. Dan, now the alpha of his pack, and Fiona, recognized as the most powerful witch of her generation, were married under a full moon. Their bond was more than a mating. It was a treaty, a promise. Dan became the alpha, and Fiona, his supreme Luna, ruled not just over the werewolves, but served as a bridge to the witch covens. Under their joint leadership, an era of unprecedented peace and prosperity dawned. The scars of the past remained, but they were reminders of the cost of division and the strength found in unity. Years later, the sounds of laughter replaced the echoes of battle. 3 children, 2 boys with their father's warm hazel eyes and a little girl with her mother's fiery red hair and a surprising talent for summoning sparks of light, chased each other through the gardens of the Alpha's lodge, a living testament to a love that had ended a war and built a new world. The peace they longed for was finally here, and would be forever.